Thank you so much, Lorraine, for inviting me here. And this has been such an extraordinary panel. And I'm just always, I think back to, an evening meal that Alice Hamilton had at the residence dining hall of the Hull House with Myrtle Merritt French. And she was a famous potter who taught at the School of the Art Institute. And, Alice Hamilton was telling her about the dangers of lead poisoning that she had found. And Myrtle Merritt French realized that she was putting lead in all of her pottery glazes. And so working with Alice Hamilton, she developed one of the first lead-free glazes. They used it with the Mexican pottery that was developed at Hull House kilns that eventually became Fiesta ware. And me as a museum studies person, as art history faculty, I've just been so enriched, sitting with you all and hearing it. And obviously, this is always said, but we really need to make more efforts to bring the arts and the sciences together the way that they should be. So thank you for allowing me to be here. I just want to tell you a little bit about the Hull House Museum and also about the Alice Hamilton that we think about at the museum. She has a beautiful quote that we put in our offices where she said, "Life at Hull House satisfied every longing for companionship, for the excitement of new experiences, for constant intellectual stimulation, and for being caught up in a big movement for social change which enlisted my enthusiastic loyalty." And these are the sort of stories that we tell at the Hull House Museum today. Last year, for the 150th anniversary of Jane Addams's birth, we opened up a new core exhibition. And the motto for us was, "Never again will a single story be told as if it's the only one." And this goes for the story of Jane Addams, who is best known as America's first woman to win the Nobel Peace Prize, but we proudly display her Nobel Peace Prize in the museum next to her FBI file, because she was also considered public enemy #1 and the most dangerous woman in America. And I think this is really important for us to remember, that these women were engaged in work that was considered dangerous, threatening to the powers that be. They were constantly saying power to the people under their breath and also above their head. And for us, this also meant starting to tell the stories of the countless performers that worked alongside Jane Addams, people like Viola Spolin, Florence Kelley, and Alice Hamilton, who don't get the recognition that they really deserve. So I'm really thrilled about Alice Hamilton Day, this celebration, and the conference. We also started to tell some of the stories of the 6,000 immigrants who came to Hull House every single week to mix and to mingle with one another, to build community and to redefine democracy at a critical moment of our nation. And this commitment to giving voice is often called sort of like, oh, you're giving voice to the voiceless. And to borrow a quote from Arundhati Roy, we know, of course, there's no such thing as the voiceless, right? There's only the deliberately silenced and the preferably unheard. And, we really suffer from historical amnesia in our country. And so the museum is really an attempt to combat this on a daily basis. So when you come to the museum after this event, I hope that you will spend some time at the Ida B. Wells exhibit also. Ida B. Wells Barnett, an incredible social reformer who was leading African American women almost parallel to what was happening at the Hull House settlement, but they also worked in solidarity with one another. But we also tell the story of when Ida B. Wells Barnett challenged Jane Addams, when Jane Addams got lynching, and sort of the description of how lynching should be talked about in public wrong. So I hope you will go there. I hope that you will enter one of our new exhibitions, which is a sound room, where we try to explore not only what history looked like through artifacts, but also bring together some of the sounds of what history sounded like. And it's a really sensual experience of this history. And upstairs, we just opened a beautiful new room, which is called Unfinished Business, and it's the history of arts education in this country, and the effort to not only fight for political and economic rights for all people, but also for creative rights. And the Hull House was engaged in really demanding that people not only have access to beauty, but also the right to determine what is beautiful in their own communities and for themselves. So, as you know, Alice Hamilton lived at Hull House for 22 years. In addition to all of her accomplishments, at Harvard and her publications and her research, she was a peace activist throughout her life. She lived till 94, and one of the passages that we've been exploring recently at the Hull House is a letter that she wrote to her sister, and I just want to read you a small fragment of it, and it describes the bliss that Alice Hamilton had after a days of work, bicycling along Lakeshore Drive, drinking beers and skinny dipping in Lake Michigan. So Alice Hamilton writes, "Yesterday it was 94, and my dispensary in the morning swarmed with children, and oh, how hot they were. I soaked myself in a tub of cold water after it was over and got cooled off, but when I got to the Newberry Library later in the afternoon, I was so hot again that my brains melted away, and so I went home after 3 hours and took another bath. I think I could not live through these days if it were not for the thought of a bicycle ride in the evening. We leave the 19th Ward steaming and choking and melting, and in 15 minutes we are on the Lakeshore Drive, spinning along with the air fresh on our faces and the lake before us and the moon just coming up. We usually go to one of the most distant beer gardens, leave our wheels, and stay for an hour or so, listening to the music, drinking delicious cold Bavarian beer from stone mugs. Then we mount again and reach home between 11 and 12. One night it was so dreamy and still, and we went down to the water, took off our shoes and stockings, and sat on the embankment and jumped in, paddling in the cold water. Last night, Miss Adams went out with us on a tandem with Mr. Swope, and we rode all the way to Oak Park and back. We went to the lakeside where there is a farmhouse and a lovely Scotchwoman who gives us bread and butter and honey and eggs. Then we came home by moonlight on our wheels." So when I read this, this sort of hot, sweaty Jane Addams on a bicycle, or sort of Alice Hamilton with her stockings off, is not what we normally think of when you think of these people. But it's this image which I think we should also keep in our mind as we think of these reformers. They were such serious and formidable people, right? Going to The Hague, fighting for peace, working for juvenile justice, fighting for the 8-hour workday. And it's really difficult to think of them having fun, taking pleasure in life, telling jokes to one another, caring for one another, drawing each other baths. But it's at these sort of celebrations that we should remind ourselves that taking pleasure in life is essential as fighting for justice, because it is the right to the simple pleasures in life for all people, regardless of race, class, gender, ethnicity, that Alice Hamilton and others fought so hard for. Hull House reformers believed that everyone should have pleasure and leisure. Chicago's first public playground was established right off of Halsted and Polk because they believed that it should be a right and not just a privilege of the wealthy. And their efforts to pass the Factory and Workshop Bill in 1913 were as much about stopping the sort of greedy managers from taking advantage of the workforce as sort of the gentle insistence that we all need to stop work sometimes and take pleasure in life and one another. The settlement offered, arts and crafts and music classes for children and adults, and I really do believe it's this mixing of pleasure and work and fighting for justice that sustained Alice Hamilton and the other Hull House reformers for the many, many decades that they lived and worked at Hull House. So even though this work, the description of, the research that you all are doing in the factories and the horrible conditions that you are finding is at times uncomfortable and difficult, our work and our care for one another must always be pleasurable. One of my favorite quotes is by Emma Goldman, and she famously quipped, "If I can't dance, I don't want to be a part of your revolution." And we keep that in mind at the Hull House all the time. In the museum, there's the opportunity to actually dance in our new exhibit, so I hope that you will do that. I really thank you for all of the wonderful work that you do, making this world a more just place for all of us. There's a beautiful reception in the residence dining hall. The museum is open for you to sort of, walk through and linger as long as you want. We also have lots of programming at the museum. We run an urban farm. There's a weekly soup kitchen, and so please join us whenever you want. It's your house too. So I'm looking forward to welcoming you to the museum now.